So welcome to episode 7 of Untangling the Worldknot. I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague, Greg Enriquez. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
So Greg, I wanted to follow up on some of the points we had gotten to last time. We've been talking a lot about, aspectualization and things like that, and just perspectival knowing. And what I thought we'd do is do a case study that will help to make these ideas more concrete and understandable, but that will also give me more information by which I can advance the argument and make proposals about the nature of consciousness.
Amen. That sounds good. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to do something I don't normally like to do, especially when we're in dialogue like this, but I am going to sort of share my screen, and because I got some slides, because I'm riffing off of a talk I've given in 2 separate occasions. Keep modifying it, of course, and I want to sort of run this with you and run through it with you. So,
since I often share slides, John, then it would be this is a good thing. This balances us out.
Okay, so that's fine for you. Okay, so what I want to talk about is, I want to start with an acknowledgement right from the beginning. Why it's called Seeing into Being on Mars and Beyond. It's about how NASA scientists on Earth use the rovers on Mars in order to do field work there.
Right.
And it's going to turn out that this is a very powerful case study that will help us to get a lot of more understanding about perspectival knowing, and then another kind of knowing that I think we've alluded to a couple times, participatory knowing, and then bring that into more directly into the discussion of consciousness. I do want to begin with an acknowledgement that a lot of this work has been done and continues to be done with another good friend of mine, Dan Chiappi, who's at the University of California, Long Beach. And so we are doing this ongoing work. So, I owe a lot to Dan in this argument. I'm not going to keep referencing him. So I want to give a global thing right up front, right from the beginning.
Great.
All right. So the rovers on Mars are a really exemplary study of a lot of the 4E themes that we've been talking about: embodiment, embedded, enacted, extended. And the main problem I want to address, at least initially, in what we're going through here, has to do with how the scientists, using only very limited visual information, nevertheless get something that's crucial to the phenomenology of consciousness. They get a sense of presence. They get a sense of being on Mars, not just looking at pictures that refer to Mars, but the sense of being on Mars. And that's important because we've already been talking about that. We've been talking about this demonstrative indexicality of consciousness, the sense of, that sense of here now togetherness, this here now togetherness, that sense of presence. And this gives us a really wonderful case study for investigating that sense of presence, trying to tease it out more and learn more about consciousness in the process. That's part of what I want to do here. And so I'm going to go through something which is a little bit along the way. I want to show how the generation of theory, propositional knowing, depends on procedural abilities with the skills of what are called field work. That in turn depends on situational awareness, which is the primary thing that is generated by perspectival knowing. And then I want to show how that is ultimately dependent on something deeper. So seeing as if you're on Mars depends on seeing as if you're the rover. There's a process of identification that takes place between the scientists and the rover that is actually necessary of presence. And that's going to help me articulate a bit more about what this participatory knowing is. Not why is that relevant? It's relevant right off the bat because consciousness has this weird feature about it that you know it in, you not only know consciousness perspectively, what it's like to be here now, here now togetherness, right? We've talked about that, the adverbial qualia, but you know you're conscious by being conscious. You know you're conscious by being conscious. This is the core of participatory knowing. It's knowing by being. And what's interesting about these scientists is that they take on the role of, obviously not in a literal sense, but in a very symbolic, inactive sense, they take on the role of being the rover. And that actually affords them the necessary situational awareness. So I want to try and go through with this one step at a time. Okay, so let's be clear about a couple things right from the beginning. The rovers send back batch pictures you know, and they're in black and white, there is no joystick control. There is no joystick control because of the time delay between Earth and Mars. There's no joystick control. What happens is, you know, you get batches of pictures, and then you send in a whole bunch of commands, and then it's a batch of commands is sent back out. And so, and there's terrific time delay. So there's huge displacements in time and space and type of environment between the scientists and the rover. Okay?
Right.
Yeah, it's the scientists on Earth, right, who are using the visual information from the rover to correct, you know, to direct and correct the rover. What I mean by that is, don't think that the rover obviously has some AI, but don't think that the rover's AI is sufficient enough that it's sort of moving itself around and doing any work in an autonomous fashion. That's not the case. The scientists are the ones doing the science through the rover on Mars. Okay, so this is a clear case of examining what's called extended cognition. Extended cognition is the idea that a lot of our cognition doesn't take place in our head. It takes place through machines, through tools, through other people, through distributed cognition. So it's a clear case of extended cognition. However, so while it picks up on that theme of extended cognition, it seems to deeply challenge the other E's. I mean, the scientists are not embodied, right? The body, the rover body is on Mars. They're not embedded on Mars. And they're obviously not enacting on Mars. They're on Earth typing code into a computer. Okay, okay, so there's all those problems. Now, given that most of the E's are missing, the embodiment and the embeddedness, right, and the enacted aspects, one might suspect that people have a very distant, displaced, alienated experience of Mars through this medium. But that's not actually the case. And this is the intriguing thing. What is the case is that scientists regularly and reliably report that they feel like they're on Mars. They sense being on Mars. The way you right now sense that you're in that room you're in, and I sense that I'm in the room I'm in. They have that sense of presence that we've been talking about, which is really weird if you think about it.
They know what it's like to be a rover?
So it's very, very odd. So they report that they're seeing as the rover. They're seeing as if they're the rover.
So John, and just in terms of, so they are, they get these batch photos, right? And obviously these are scientists that are very familiar with the machinery of the rover, right? In terms of, or not, I guess that's a question that I would have in relationship
to varying degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically have sort of this dynamically restructuring small world network way in which they organize themselves, and they have various degrees of expertise. And there are people who are more specialized in sort of managing and moving the rover, and then there's people who are more like geologists, and then there's people who are more like meteorologists, things like that. So in a collective sense, yes, there's definitely the expertise. Okay, now what's interesting is the scientists who are in the group, because they often have to hire new people, etc. There's attrition, new problems come up, etc. They report that they look for people who can have that experience, who can have that sense of presence, sense of being on Mars, because the scientists report that ability to generate that experience is actually predictive of the people who are able to do good work with the rover. Do good field work on Mars. So it's not just some sort of weird thing that sort of jangles over there. It's actually a highly prized experience that is predictive, according to the scientists at least, of good work. All right. Okay. So given how disrupted the 4E features are, how is it the scientists can nevertheless acquire the phenomenological markers of embeddedness in action, right? And even, as we'll see later, embodiment? How do they do that? And of course, all along, why are we doing this? Because we're trying to understand this sense of presence, and we're trying to understand that because it has a lot to do with the perspectival knowing that is at the core of consciousness. Okay, so far?
Yep, totally.
Great. Okay, so what's fortunate about this, and Dan and I you know, we're lucky because we live in the age of virtual reality, video games, etc. And so there's quite a bit of research on sense of presence in video games. What are the features of a video game that make people have that sense of being in the game, and that correspondingly, and this is important, that it's more real to them. There's a deep connection between sense of presence and sense of realness. And this is because, and the reason why the people are doing this research is this is a highly sought after feature of, for example, of a video game. So we have two video games, and this one reliably generates sense of presence, and this one doesn't. This one will be preferred and will have much greater chance of market success over this. So there's something normative, there's something inherently valued, probably an evolutionary marker of some kind. For sense of presence seems to be something the organisms seek out in an important way. We'll try and cover that off. Now, why is that important? Well, if we can figure out how sense of presence is adaptive, and sense of presence is a way of is a case where we can, you know, get into the guts of perspectival knowing, and if perspectival knowing is central to consciousness, this will give us a powerful way at getting at some of the functionality of consciousness. If consciousness involves perspectival knowing, which generates sense of presence, and we know what the functionality of sense of presence is, we can start to answer the function question. And of course, what's interesting about sense of presence is it's not just a functional thing, it's deeply phenomenological. It has a lot to do with the feel of being conscious. And so we're getting what we talked about doing. We're getting a case study, right, where we can deeply look at the function question and the nature question together. Okay. Now, I'm not going to try and give an exhaustive definition of sense of presence. That's the whole thing. But there's a couple of key points that need to be made clear. As I said, the sense of presence is the sense of being there, that indexical sense of here-nowness and togetherness, things with the adverbial qualia. So it's what the sense of presence is that the adverbial qualia are happening. I mean, that's a clear and easy way of putting it. So, as I mentioned, it has a lot to do with the sense of realness and that it's normative and it's valuable. Okay. Now, so given the VR research, virtual reality research, what are the things that tend to generate this sense of presence? And why does it have this normative value for us? Why is it functional for us? Why do we value it? Why do we seek it out? Why do we have even aesthetic approval for it? Okay, so a powerful intuition people have is that what creates sense of presence is verisimilitude. So how realistic, and this is because of the sense of realness, you can understand the intuition, right? How realistic the game is what actually is conducive to a sense of presence. It turns out that's not the case. It turns out that you can have, you know, video games that are quite realistic and you don't get a sense of presence. And you can have other video games like Tetris that generate a tremendous sense of presence. Even
I was a Tetris addict.
Right? Did you dream in Tetris?
I mean, when I was into it, you know, I pushed the limit on that thing. I was definitely into that game. I was the boxes, John. I was the boxes.
Well, there you go. So the interesting thing about it then is that you get pretty like on both, you know, so I could show it's not sufficient, neither is it necessary. And so I'm not saying that verisimilitude can't contribute. What I've given you, though, is an argument that it can't be essential to the sense of presence.
Actually, this is really interesting because I felt the shapes of the blocks. You know, I can say, I'm really not really, I can easily access that. I felt the shapes of the blocks and the structure. I felt the speed. I felt the flow. That's interesting. Yeah, good.
Yeah, well, thank you. That further corroborating evidence, which is always helpful and wonderful. Okay, so one of the interesting ideas is then to try and, so what we've done is we've problematized this, right? And so it's not verisimilitude. Well, what is it? So one of my former students, Gary Overhanneson, in 2019 argued that what is predictive of the sense of presence is to get into the flow state. So if you're in the flow state, right, that's what predicts a sense of presence. And this is, of course, very plausible because when people are in the flow state, they state that they're at one with the environment. The environment is super salient. There's an ongoing sense of discovery, right? So it's a very plausible hypothesis because it's very plausible, for example, that you could have a realistic game that doesn't get you into the flow state, and therefore you don't get a sense of presence, but you could be in Tetris and get into the flow state, etc. Okay, so this is, I think this is a very plausible account for video games. However, the problem is flow is not going to be the answer for the situation we're studying, because what you need for flow, according to Csikszentmihalyi and all the replicated work, what I need for flow is 3 conditions. Error has to matter. Well, moving the rovers around, error matters. That's definitely there, right? If I screw up, that's it. Error, the rover's done, kaput. So that's there. But the 2 other things I need for flow is I need clear signal and I need tightly coupled feedback. But you know what the scientists don't have? They don't have tightly coupled feedback because they don't have joystick control like in a video game. They don't, and they don't get clear signal. They spend hours arguing over these deeply ambiguous pictures that come back from Mars. So they don't have clear signal. They don't have tightly coupled feedback. So it looks like this proposal that seems to be very plausible for getting sense of presence in video games is not going to work for the scientists on Mars. But what I can argue is maybe flow contains within it a more basic phenomena that can be nevertheless the case on Mars. Right? So maybe flow contains within it a more basic phenomena. So maybe flow is a species of a more generic process, and that generic process might be sufficient for explaining the sense of presence. Okay, so this is the process that is coming up a lot in 4E cognitive science, the idea of optimal grip. Now, clearly, what's happening in the flow state is a state of enhanced optimal grip. So what's optimal grip? This is the idea, and we've talked about this before, right? The idea that, right, I'm constantly trading off between, features and gestalt, between familiar and unfamiliar, between the foreground and the background, and I'm constantly toggling between all these trade-off relationships to get the overall optimal set of features and properties that will enable me to deal with the tasks that are at hand. I'm getting an optimal grip on the situation. Now, flow is a species of optimal grip, but there are many instances. For example, I think I have a pretty good optimal grip on your face right now, but I'm not sort of in the flow state. And so what I want to propose to you is the flow state is sort of like where you've got insights that are creating new instances of optimal grip, but it's actually the optimal grip that is generating the sense of presence.
Okay. So let me just summarize. So we can create an aspectualizing form, right, around the entity and system that we're in. And we're going to basically now pull that aspectualizing form and then start to engage a process with it, in a particular way that generates a dynamic, engaging feedback in a way that allows for, say, a flow of energy or whatever kind of dynamic in a particular investment path, I might say.
That's well put. Yes, I think that's actually very well put. So the idea here is the scientists are able to, nevertheless, in this very thin information channel, use it with some cultivated expertise to get the optimal grip that starts to make Mars, opens up affordances of intelligibility for them for Mars. So I think that's very much in concert with what you just said. Is that
100%? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So I've said, what optimal grip is. I've given some components of it, gestalt, and we've talked about this before already when we've been talking about consciousness. So let's let's just keep going.
Mhm.
And so here's the idea. I thought this was, because we've talked about aspectuality and centrality and temporality before. And so this is the idea is that you're doing the optimal grip is toggling things. So things that are aspectualized, they are relevant to you, they are temporally irrelevant. So you get optimal grip that is giving you a salience landscaping, moving between aspectuality, centrality, and temporality. And when that salience landscape glues you into, right, the affordances in the environment, right, you feel a sense of presence.
Right.
You feel a sense of presence.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I want to call this optimal grip sizing up salience landscaping that affords situational awareness, because that's what it is, right? That's what situational awareness is. It's the salience landscape that glues you in to the affordances in the environment. I want to call that whole thing something we've already been talking about before, perspectival knowing.
Right.
That's what perspectival knowing is. It's knowing what it's like to be here now through, in both senses of the word, my current state of mind. Okay.
Yep.
So again, deeply part of that aspect of consciousness made famous by Nagel, knowing what it's like to be. Right? Okay. Now my claim. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to offer just sort of an angle on this. So I've been researching the evolution of animal consciousness. Okay. Right. And a really interesting 2017 book, I think it was on the evolution of animal consciousness or whatever, it was talking about, a plane of intersection between interoceptive awareness, like what the body is telling, exteroceptive awareness, and pleasure, pain, affectivity, so just in relationship to what is this optimal grip doing, bringing in information in a gestalt, understanding where the body wants to go, finding the affordances and the potential costs is a nice intersection. I think that then, corresponds to, potentially sets the stage for this field of perspectival knowing.
I think that's exactly right. I know the book you're talking about. I have it. I can't remember the authors as well right now. So we're both getting old, I guess. Okay. So the main claim I've now argued too is that the sense of presence is a phenomenological feel of and marker for perspectival knowing. Sense of presence is the phenomenological feel of perspectival knowing. Okay. So how do scientists generate this perspectival knowing? How do they see as if they're the rover? And the part of the argument I'm going to make is they see as if they're the rover by by being the rover in a very important way. All right. So Vervaeke, in her excellent book, Seeing Like a Rover, talks about this. So it's an extended ethnography. She was an anthropologist. She went there. She spent. There's other ethnographies that corroborate, cohere with this. This is a work that, right? So extended ethnography, and she talks about this process, and it's very interesting. What she calls drawing as. So the drawing as. So it's based on. It's based on aspectualization because it's based on Wittgenstein's notion of seeing as. Remember your example of you see the picture as a duck or you see it as a rabbit, right? So it's aspectualization. That's exactly what she's talking about, right? So what happens is the scientists get these pictures, right, these photos, and what they do is they mark them up. They put color on them, they put lines on them, they put arrows on them. They do all this stuff to manipulate the salience. So, and she calls this drawing as, and she's actually playing on the word because she means drawing as in the sense of drawing, but also drawing out.
Drawing out,
yeah, right. So that you can see it as. And the idea is you get this black and white picture, you don't know what it is, and you do all this stuff that is actually not verisimilitude. You're putting colors on it and all this, right? Right? You're drawing on it. You're in a sense of precision. You're distorting the picture. But you distort it in the way so that you can then start, it aspectualizes and you can see it as, you can go, oh, that's a depression there, right? The topography goes, oh, I see, right? And there's a texture gradient there. Things have rolled down that hill, They look for that pop out kind of effect.
Right. So that then by putting that angle on it, they pull various aspects of the salience landscape together.
Right. So, exactly. So what they're doing is they're doing this deliberate salience manipulation, right? So they're deliberately doing salience landscaping, right, externally on the pictures in order to aspectualize that information. And then what that does is that makes it available for problem solving. Okay, so they're doing all of this. And when they start to do that, right, they start to get a bit of what we're talking about here. But seeing as if you're being on Mars really depends on more than just this drawing as. So one half of the answer is the drawing as, and it fits right into this analysis beautifully that we've been making together about consciousness and perspectival knowing and salience landscaping and aspectualization and all of that stuff, right? Great. But there's more to it. Okay, so I talked about the drawing as. We don't need to go through every single slide in detail here. It's up there if people want to look at it. Vervaeke, so we've got the drawing as process, and then Vervaeke talks about this other set of practices the scientists do. So first of all, they anthropomorphize the rover. They don't say the rover needs to go there. They'll say, I need to go there, or we need to go there, or I need to move my arm, which means that one of the rover's tools, right? And they'll talk about the rover falling asleep and waking up, and they don't want it to die, right? So they anthropomorphize. They do this, symbolic identification process. But they do more than just anthropomorphize. They also, and this is a term I think coined by Vervaeke, they technomorphize themselves. They technomorphize themselves. So here's the sense of presence. I'm talking about, I call it the second sense of presence because this is the sense of presence that's actually being used by the scientists rather than just one making us feel wonderful about Mars. Okay, so that's just why the slide has that title. Okay, so here's this scientist, and notice what the scientists do. This is technomorphizing. So the scientist that she's trying to figure out, right, how to adjust the rover, and so she puts her phone down in front and says, the phone is a rock, and then these are my cameras, and she's on like a wheelchair, and she starts to turn her body and then swivel and move. And this is what she's doing. This is what I need to do. And she's using the I language. This is what I need to do in order to, right, get this needed information from the rover. Okay. So there's this loop that's being created. There's this, right, anthropomorphizing from human to rover, but also technomorphizing from rover to human. So there's this reciprocal shaping of identity. You're humanizing the rover, but you're also mechanizing, if that's even a verb, right? The human beings, the scientists. And so what you're doing is you're doing this reciprocal shaping of identities. So I want to read this out. I'm not usually going to read from but just because the wording here is a little bit careful. And there's a couple more things I'm going to have to read. And I have to read them for the explicit reason that I'm literally quoting the scientists, okay? So I know reading is a little bit rude. I apologize. I will keep it to a minimum here. We'll keep it to a minimum.
Good.
But there's an inactive integration of knowing oneself through the rover and knowing the rover through oneself so that one is simultaneously knowing oneself, knowing the rover, and knowing through the rover. All of those things are happening at the same time, which of course is very similar to how you know your body, right? You know yourself by knowing your body. You know yourself by, as having a body, but you also know yourself through the body. You know the world through the body. So they're doing something that is structurally analogous to embodiment.
Right.
Really powerful way. Now, this mutual shaping is very analogous to how evolution in niche construction mutually shapes an organism and its environment, or how culture mutually shapes, you know, its participants in the environment. And what does this mutual shaping do? Well, it generates affordances. So here's a classic example. Here's this cup. Okay, so because of evolution, here's an affordance. It's graspable. We've talked about something like this before, right? So biologically, right, because of niche construction, I can grasp it, right? Because it's my hand has evolved to fit certain shapes in the environment. There's niche construction, right? Culturally, it's a tool. It's a cup, and you know, I've been shaped to be a drinker. And then, of course, I have my ongoing situational awareness that I can actually use it. So there's biological affordances, there are cultural affordances, and then there's my direct awareness of how I can use those affordances to get a drink right here, right now. Okay? So I want to call that process by which agent and environment are co-shaped, agent and arena, so that affordances are generated between them. I want to call that participatory knowing. It's a knowing by being. It's a knowing by being a particular kind of agent and being in a particular kind of arena. It's a knowing by being. It's a knowing by being.
Right. So what we're saying is the agent, the agent has a sense of what kind of agent it is in the arena that it is. Right. I mean, that sounded maybe, I was being redundant there to just emphasize the dynamic relation.
No, I think that was helpful. I think that what you just did wasn't, it might have been syntactically redundant, but I don't think it was semantically redundant. I think it's important. Okay, so here's one of these quotes I'm going to read. And again, because I want to show you the phenomenology. I want to make it clear to people that I'm not attributing things to the scientists. Okay, so this is a quote from that woman who you saw the drawing of, right? Who was put the rock down in front. She says, "My body, by the way, is always the rover." This is a hard-nosed scientist on NASA. My body, by the way, is always the rover. So right here, touches chest, is the front of the rover. My magnets are right here, touches the base of her neck. And my shoulders are the front of the solar panel. And that means she moves forward and displays her arms up to other sides, the rest of it. So I have all kinds of things, antenna sticking up over here, gestures to her back, laughs. But when I'm taking a picture of something in the atmosphere, then it helps me to kind of look up, sits up and looks straighter. Being the rover, and this is the front of me, touches the chest, and then I put my head up, puts head up and looks back and forth, whatever, to whichever vector I'm looking at. So you see what, like she's completely identifying with the rover in an embodied, enacted way. So another scientist had this to say, because I want to talk about what this sense of identification does, some other phenomenological markers. So another scientist said, "I was working in the garden one day and all of a sudden, I don't know what's going on with my right wrist. I cannot move it. Out of nowhere, I get here to the planning meeting and Spirit," that's one of the rovers, "has its right front wheel stuck." Things like that, you know. I am totally connected to Spirit. No pun intended there, but maybe a little bit of a pun, right? Like this, you see what's going on here? The phenomenology borders on being magical, such that the identification is such that, right, these weird synchronicities become super salient to the scientists. Another scientist said something similar to say, "Interestingly, I screwed up my shoulder and needed surgery right about the time that Opportunity's IDD arm started having problems with a stiff shoulder joint. And I broke my toe right before Spirit's wheel broke. So I'm just saying, maybe it's kind of sympathetic. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's any magic involved or anything, but maybe it's some kind of unconscious, subconscious thing. I don't know." Try to show you how deep this participatory knowing is. It's deep. It's very profound. It's phenomenologically very, very present to the scientists. So notice we've got two things going on here. we've got a coordinated manipulation of perspectival knowing through the drawing as, and a manipulation of participatory knowing through this anthropomorphic, technomorphic looping. And then when you do that, you get the sense of presence. You get the sense of being on Mars. You get a sense of being the rover on Mars. And that sense is functional because it allows you to do the best field work through the rovers on Mars. Now, of course, all of this is being done implicitly and tacitly. None of the scientists, they discovered this for themselves. No, but they didn't go to, wow, how to improve field work on Mars, do this or do, they have like sort of, right, implicitly and tacitly figured this all out in a collective fashion.
Yes. Yes. They've drawn on their intuitive tendency for participatory knowledge to embody this.
Exactly. So, let's zero in on that connection now between the situational awareness that is given to me by a sense of presence. So what am I proposing? I'm proposing that participatory knowing generates affordances, and then perspectival knowing turns those affordances into salient affordances. And salient affordances within salience landscaping is what we mean by situational awareness. And situational awareness is the state you need to have in order to acquire and apply skills. Situational awareness is the state you need to have in order to acquire and apply skills. So the procedural ability, knowing how to do something, is dependent on the perspectival, like knowing what it's like to be, which is of course also dependent and interrelated with knowing how to, knowing by being the rover. That's what I wanted to say.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want to zero in on an important feature of skills. So this will seem like a digression for a bit. Okay. So we've got this argument built up here, over here, about perspectival knowing, participatory knowing, situational awareness, generating affordances, making them salient, etc. That's all here. So that's trying to hold that, right? Okay. And I want to, the bridge, of course, is to acquiring and applying skills. But I want to note something very important about skills. Now, this goes to the work of the neuroscientist Reid Montague. He sounds like a Shakespearean figure, right? Reid Montague. Who do we need now? We need Reid Montague, right? And so he wrote a really interesting book a while ago, not that long ago. I think it was like 2010. I'm not sure. I'd have to check. It had a really provocative title. It said, "Your brain is almost perfect," which is a really interesting title for a book. Of course, you're gonna pick that book up, right? So, anyways, he first of all poses a problem, and it's at the core of skills. Okay, so if I'm going to engage in skillful behavior, I want to be as efficient as I possibly can. Right. Because if you and I are in a Darwinian competition, and I can use some skill more efficiently than you, I'm going to outcompete you, right? Just outcompete you. Okay, so let's say that's relatively non-controversial. Okay, so how do I make my skills more efficient? Well, one of the things you do, and you, of course, think about how much you have to coordinate in order to, right, use a skill. You have to coordinate different things together. Or let's say let's even use an analogy. You're trying to get a bunch of people to work together. Well, you have to coordinate their behavior. Well, how do you coordinate their behavior? Well, they have to communicate with each other, right? And there has to be communication between the parts of my hand, etc., via the brain, etc. So the idea is, okay, I increase the efficiency of a skill by increasing the internal communication, because that reduces me working at cross purposes, working in internal conflict, etc. So I can increase coordination, right? And that's by increased communication. Okay. But Montague says, but wait, there's a problem. The problem with that is, right? What efficiency does, efficiency is not only improve the product, efficiency is also reduce the cost.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he says the problem with, right, as you increase communication, right,
Mm-hmm.
is the cost of your processing goes up, and it goes up in a nonlinear fashion. And that's why you get the effect of all the people in the room talking. There's so much cacophony and noise, right? And trying to get that right. So the metabolic cost goes up very rapidly. So the brain seems like, he says, it looks like the brain's caught in a dilemma. It needs to increase efficiency by increasing communication, and it needs to increase efficiency by reducing communication. Oh. Okay, so there's all these important trade-off relationships. Okay, so Montague proposes that the brain actually has a really powerful way of solving this problem. Now, in order to explain it, I'm going to use his analogy.
Okay.
And the analogy is of like an old married couple that they're happily married. Some people stay married so that they can torture each other. I understand that. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about people that have been together a long time and they want to be together. And they have that almost telepathy. They seem to be able to communicate a lot with very little. I had a beloved aunt and uncle that had exactly that kind of relationship. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's like, well, they don't actually have telepathy. So Montague says, well, what do they have is, let's say, I'll just use his model. It tends to be, it's a model based on a straight marriage, but that's not relevant. But I'm going to use it because it's easier for me to do the reference.
Sure.
Right. I can just talk about the man and the woman. It just makes it faster and easier. Nothing else is implied by using those terms about marriage or anything like that. Okay. So the woman has internalized a model of the man, and the man has internalized a model of the woman. There's what's called mutual modeling. They mutually model each other, so that the woman can actually have her behavior coordinated with the man without them having to talk to each other, because she just consults her model and he just consults his model. So you have what you seem to be getting with this is the benefits of increased communication without actually communicating, and thereby keeping the costs of communication down. And so Montague sort of leaves it at that, right? And I want to do a couple things to try and enforce it. He just makes the claim that there's all kinds of evidence that the brain is doing this. And at a neuroscientific level, I'm sure he's right. I'm not going to challenge it, but I want to bring up sort of evidence that has a more phenomenological feel to it.
Okay.
About this. Okay. So one is synesthesia. So synesthesia is the fact that you get human beings in which the information from one sense modality seems to pass to the other. Like people say, I can taste shapes.
Right.
Things. That's a classic example. And what that means is that you've got sort of the tactile layer of the brain, or at least one plausible explanation, and the taste area of the brain are actually deeply mutually modeling each other. You can get actually acquired synesthesia. Two famous examples, and think of how this is going to, right? Okay, so you have Bat Boy, and think about Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat. Okay, so the Bat Boy, well, there's now I think 128 cases of this, so it's not some weird loopy single case, right? He was blind, and he taught himself like a bat. He taught himself echolocation. He taught himself to make noises and use the sound, and he reports having something like visual experience, but also not like visual experience. And he says it's sort of out here, about this big. So he is using sound to do something like seeing. We also know, and this is reported by Walsh and others, and something I can assent to as well, long-term meditators tend to get acquired synesthesia. They tend to start to get synesthetic drift between the various sense modalities. Why? Because they're spending a lot of time, right? Basically they're spending a lot of time doing this mutual modeling. That's what you're doing when you're sort of inside your, that inner space. So you say, well, so what? Well, I want to point out to you very quickly how synesthetic everybody is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a picture, okay? And what I want everybody to do is, as rapidly as possible, I'm going to show a picture. I want you to point to the picture that is Uba and the picture that's Kiki, okay?
Yep.
Go. So overwhelmingly, like beyond 95% concordance, people point to the right picture as Booba, even though I said Booba first, and the left picture is Kiki. And you go, well, so what? That's synesthesia. What the heck is the connection between Booba and that picture? And people will say things, well, Booba is kind of round, and so is the picture. And you go, what do you mean Booba's round? Or they'll say, Kiki is sharp, and that's sharp. And you go, what? What are you talking about? Right? Okay, so all of this is evidence that various parts of the brain are mutually modeling each other. The visual cortex and the auditory cortex, right, are mutually modeling each other all the time. And that makes sense, right, in terms of the coordination you would need for skill performance. Is that okay so far?
Yes.
Yeah. And notice how much this mutual model, like think about the bat point, seeing how the mutual modeling is actually affording aspectualization and all kinds of interesting things. Absolutely. Okay. So some of the work I'm doing with Anderson Todd and Richard Wu and F.A. Nguyen and others, like we're working on this model of consciousness, right? We revise Montague's idea a little bit, because, you know, if my aunt and my uncle never spoke again, their models would eventually drift apart. Right? Sure. Models would eventually drift apart. So periodically, they do have to come together, talk to each other, and do any corrections to distortions that have come into the model. Right. Right? And I guess you get that at times in couples therapy, where people have to come in and really get back in tune with each other. Yeah. Now, you can actually see human beings shifting between these two modes. You can, right? So let's take it that I have my modules, right? And when I'm task focused, they're just working. They're focused on the world, and and one area of my brain is relying on its model of another area, and vice versa, so that they can be highly coordinated together. Okay. But then there must be a period where they have to stop doing that and go back and talk to each other and make sure that they are properly modeling each other, so that the integration isn't infected with distortion. Well, what would that look like? Well, that would look like what happens to human beings. They cycle between being task focused and mind wandering, right? In fact, right? You're focused, and then your mind goes off, and in that we know you get the default mode network is highly engaged, and what's it doing there? It's very self-referential. It deals with information that's self-relevant. And what do we know from the work of Suey and Humphreys? That self-relevant information is the glue. It's how you glue things together. Well, what does that mean practically? It means that I make sure that my models are properly tracking each other so that they can properly coordinate behavior. So you actually cycle in this way all the time. It's indicative of something like this mutual modeling centrally going on in your cognition at many levels. Now, of course, you can't just have mutual model of everything, because that would be combinatorially explosive. Come back to that issue later. So what I want to propose to you is that skills require recursive mutual modeling. So, right, why recursive? Well, different parts of my finger have to be mutually modeled, my little finger, and then there has to be mutual modeling between my fingers, and then between my fingers and my palm, between my fingers and my palm and my thumb, and between my hand and my wrist, right, and then my hand and my wrist and my elbow, etc. That's what I mean by recursive mutual modeling. Is that okay? All right.
Sort of. Would that be also sort of then nested hierarchy of modeling, like where the parts are embedded?
Totally, very much. And yeah, I know what you can do with that. So I'm sure you're going to do interesting stuff with it. But so ultimately there must be mutual. And so now what I want to do is say, okay, so we've got the notion of mutual modeling, central to skills. We have the notion of recursive between layers of mutual modeling, centered to skills. We know that skills, their acquisition and their application is ultimately dependent on perspectival knowing, and that the perspectival knowing is ultimately dependent on the participatory knowing. Mm-hmm. Here's what I want to suggest to you, that is a meta kind of coordination that's needed. Mm-hmm. Such that I want to propose to you that there must be mutual modeling between participatory and perspectival knowing. Participatory knowing is generating affordances that are potentially relevant to perspectival knowing. Mm-hmm. And perspectival knowing is selecting which affordances to make salient within situational awareness. Participatory knowing and perspectival knowing have to be mutually modeling each other. And they would go through cycles where, right, they're more independently operating, and then cycles where they're more talking to each other to coordinate, coordinate their modeling of each other. And I'm arguing that that would be a requirement for any acquisition and application of any skill.
Okay.
So to put it in more of a slogan, and so don't forget everything I've said and just remember the slogan, but for mnemonic purposes, mutual modeling in the coordination not only within, but between kinds of knowing. This now gives me a hypothesis or a proposal. Consciousness as the mutual modeling between kinds of knowing. It's the mutual modeling between participatory knowing and perspectival knowing.
Okay.
The participatory knowing of and through perspectival knowing, and the perspectival knowing of and through participatory knowing. So what you got here is, right, the perspectival knowing is on the left and the participatory is on the right. The perspectival knowing is giving me aspectuality, centrality, temporality. It's giving me the adverbial qualia. It's giving me that demonstrative indexicality, the this, here, nowness, togetherness of consciousness. The participatory knowing is giving me affordance generation, the co-shaping and fitting of the agent of arena, and it's creating that inactive covariation between me and the environment. You see what I'm doing? I'm bringing back the pieces of Descartes. The participatory knowing is creating these really affording covariations, and then the perspectival knowing is turning those covariations into something that is ready for skill acquisition, analogous to how Descartes proposed, right, that consciousness turned the covariations into representations available for reason. What I'm proposing is, right, the perspectival knowing with it, right, takes the covariations, the affordances from participatory knowing, and converts them into not what is ready for reason, but what is ready for action, what is ready for skill acquisition and skill application.
All right.
That's the argument. That's the argument I wanted to make. Okay. And so there's a lot of work we still need to do. We still need to go in and take this way of thinking, right, and all the machinery we've worked and put it into deep discussion with some of the best models we have of the function and nature of consciousness. But what I'm going to argue throughout is that there's a deep convergence about what the function of consciousness is. It's this higher order recursive relevance realization that allows us to aspectualize things so that we can engage in agent arena fitted action for the world. That's a lot of what the consensus is about what consciousness, how it functions. And what I've tried to show you is, if you accept that functionality, it gives you so much of the phenomenology. It gives you adverbial qualia. It gives you the sense of fittedness. It gives you the sense of what it's like to be here now. It gives you the participatory knowing of consciousness. You know you're conscious by being conscious, etc.
Right. So let me see if I can piece this together a little bit in terms of the just the frame of the perspectival into the participatory and the dynamic interrelationship between the two.
Greg, I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can have a more direct thing.
So let me share with you sort of a less developed model, but one that I found very useful in the clinic room.
Right.
To see if this track some with some of the sort of what I would call intuitive, meaning non-self-conscious, but therefore I think, participatory, dynamic relations that people would have in their sequences of engagement. Okay. And so what I developed a thing called the PME relation. Okay. Where P stands for perception.
Right.
Okay. And that's going to head into perspectival knowing. All right. M stands for motivation. Okay. Which has two different states of approach and avoidance. Okay. And then E stands for emotion, which is to energize motive in a particular, so what we see a lot of, for example, is individuals perceiving a particular event, referencing it in relationship to their goals, okay, getting emotion, and then responding accordingly as they try to regulate the costs and benefits or stressors and affordances in a dynamic, iterative pattern.
Right.
So when I hear your participatory knowing and think about the grip of the agent arena relation, and I think about the components of that as to how the system is perceiving where it is, thinking about where it's trying to go, enacting particular affordances to extract those patterns of investments, I hear a lot of similarity in that dynamic relation.
So let me ask questions to make sure I'm seeing the same connections you are. So I expect that when you are working with people in a therapeutic context, when you say perception, you don't mean like just literal perception. You mean something like how they've aspectualized, what aspect of the thing, how they're determining how it's salient and relevant to them, right?
Absolutely.
And then of course that's a perspectival knowing. So I agree with you there. Are we in sync?
We're in sync there.
And then of course, but that's right. That is grounded in ultimately the sense of identity that they're assuming in connection with it. How they're right, the agent arena participation and the affordances that are available, but also the affordances that become unavailable in a particular. So there could be ways, I'm thinking also of your sort of filters, there could be ways in which people, Greg, I'm not as well versed as you, so I'm going to probably use this in the wrong way, so be charitable with me. But there's ways in which people could repress, they could repress at a participatory level because they could refuse to bend on an identity and therefore not have access to affordances. They could also repress at a perspectival level because they could be fixated on a one aspect and not be able to pick up alternative aspects. Is that
100%? Yeah, absolutely. So we can put this, let's put this in sort of a, so here, let's see if this flies, okay? In terms of the kind of both the models that people have. So their perspectival then will dump into their both identity and memory structures. Yep, totally. Okay, so they'll pull on that kind of narrative. There's also, if we get into the person level, self-conscious justification. All right. Yeah. But this maybe just because this resonates with me as a high school kid. I always like this example. When I was, so he was like, he helped me see this dynamic relation as follows. So let's say you're in at a place and you see an attractive person over. Right. And so now all of a sudden you see the person. All right. And then you'll have a perceptual gestalt. Okay. Then if it's an attractive person, all right, and your motivational approach state, okay, is to enact that, then you want to reduce the discrepancy between where you are and, say, in this case, as a heterosexual guy, where she is. Right. Okay. So I might then activate my past scripts, okay, say procedural participatory scripts of the ways in which that dance might go. Okay. One of the things then that I guess what I'm suggesting is that I'd like to think a little bit more about how motivation and emotion play in this participatory dance.
Yes, very much, very much.
So I'll finish this little narrative because it was cute for me in that. According to him, and I think there is good research for this, although it is complicated, our approach motivations operate on a slightly different time frame than our avoidance motivation. Okay. Right. So what he said he did, and I had a reflection on this as well, is that far away from the room, when you see the attractive woman, your approach motivation sees the possibility of success and the stressors of getting rejected are lesser. But as you move closer and closer, the time paths cross. So the threat of getting rejected then meets you halfway across the room, which is why you get halfway over there, stop and turn back and head back to your bar stool without asking her out. And I had an ability to empathize with that particular sequence, right? And so what I'm saying is that to me, as we lay down this participatory dance, the dynamic relations intrapsychically between our perceptions, our motivations, and our emotions with the affordances and costs are engaged in that. That's how I talk about sort of a behavioral investment flow.
So great. So let's pick up on two sides of this. I'm going to quote Reed Montague again. What's the difference between us and computers, right? Well, we don't care about the information we're processing. We care about it, and that's right. That's that fundamental, right, affective commitment of limited times and resources. That's at the core of relevance realization. And why do we care about information processing? Because we are autopoietic. We have to take care of ourselves because we're always making ourselves. So I think, so if we remember that I'm proposing that this machinery is ultimately all running on the relevance realization machinery. Secondly, notice how you had different components and how, right? So you can even see that cycle I was talking about, right? They're sort of operating independently, right? The approach module and the avoid module, and they've got sort of mutual modeling going on, and then it flips. But in between, there's probably a moment where they're checking in with each other, right? Right, that moment of indecision, right? Well, right. And so you can see the mutual modeling function, and so you can see the mutual modeling function, and you can see the salience landscaping interacting directly in the example you just gave. And so it's going to be inherently motivational. It's going to be, and therefore it's also going to be inherently aspectual. It's going to be centralized. It's going to be temporal. It's going to have temporality to it. Right? There's going to be all that. What's it like to be here, you now? But it's also it's going to be relying on a mutual modeling between all that perspectival knowing and your sense of who and what you are and what the arena is, the agent arena. What are the affordances here? Because you will, of course, it's not just your perspective, it's the actual affordances that are available to you. So, if you're at a bar, you're much more likely to hit on a woman than if you're at a funeral, right? And things like that. Just because the opportunities aren't there for you, right? In the same way. So I think, again, we can use this theoretical machinery you've been developing to talk about all of these examples and to cover off a lot of the features that are phenomenologically present.
Amen. Yeah, that's certainly what seems so exciting about it.
Yeah, so I think that what I'm trying to add to what do I want to call it, the literature on consciousness, with your help, is these notions of adverbial qualia, salience landscaping, optimal gripping, perspectival knowing, situational awareness, and participatory knowing, and the mutual modeling between perspectival and participatory knowing. And that's a lot of new machinery that we can use. What's interesting about this machinery is I'm proposing it simultaneously allows us to talk about the function of consciousness, and the phenomenology of consciousness, and start to bridge between the function problem and the generation problem.
Right. Well, and for me, where I come at this, because I sort of, as we talked about before, I'm very frustrated with psychology, behavior, mental process, right? And then it's like actually mental process there's a neurocognitive functional view of mental behavior. And then there is this perspectival mind to consciousness deal. And there is this narrating piece, right? But now what we can do, at least certainly what I feel, is I can now take Mind 2 with all of these new conceptual tools, right? And create such a much more nuanced relationship to Mind 1, the interface between the various domains, right? And set up a nice, cool little system. And then we'll talk more about how Mind 3, once all this stuff is ready for reason, loops back and creates an identity, a self-conscious identity, explicit recursive function on top of all this. But it really generates like Jonathan Haidt, talks about the elephant and the rider,
Right, right.
but this is like, well, what is the machinery of that elephant, right?
Right.
What's really driving that elephant's its paths of affordance, and how does it dictate what its relevant realization processes, and then at what level of, what are the dynamics of that? And that, to me, what this is like, oh, there's so much richer vocabulary for all of that.
Well, that's what's exciting for me in the confluence between my work and your work, because you keep making the case to me, in a convincing manner, by the way, that at least turn it the other way around. This work can at least contribute to enhancing and enriching the descriptive metaphysics that you see that is missing and generating what you call the problem in psychology. And I agree with you that these problems, the hard problem of consciousness, and maybe we could also call it the hard problem of psychology, right? They have to be addressed in an integrated fashion. And if you feel, right, and you keep making these connections to argue for it. And so if you are concluding more than just feeling that this argument also in a coordinated fashion can help to advance the overcoming of the hard problem of psychology, then that's fantastic. That's just excellent.
It's totally fantastic. Here, actually, I just got this book. It's a good book. It's by Bruce Goldstein. It's called The Mind. Okay, I read it, what it is, if you lead it through our lens, I would argue, is it's just basically mind one. It's the neurocognitive functional view of mind one. It gives a chapter on the curiosities of consciousness, and then it ends with, well, it's a hard problem and science doesn't really look at it. And then the rest of the book is on the hidden mind, which is basically the underlying information processing and computation of neurocognition. And then it's like, okay, it's all the backstage machinery. But it basically, and it emphasizes prediction and how it pulls out particular relevance. So it's a brilliant I think a well done, up to date neurocognitive analysis. Okay. But if you were to read that, it's like, well, but then you have this whole part of you that actually sees the world. Right. And not to mention a whole nother part of you that actually talks about the world.
Well, exactly.
Talks with other people about the world that is completely dependent upon, because it's intersubjective. So you get this picture of the mind. And this is, I think, the same thing that behaviorists did, is sort of like, well, to get to the physical, so because they're embedded in a physicality reductionist view, and because of the epistemology of science, it claps with one hand when we get into interior epistemological consciousness, and it doesn't need to. But that's essentially, it's like, well, we can't speculate on unscientific things. It's like, no, we actually have introspective awareness. There's a lot of different ways to angle this, and the scientific, exterior epistemology is important in many ways, but that shouldn't, there are ways to integrate what we can know from a first person perspective. So to me, this is so much of an opportunity to enrich in the picture. And of course, if we think about the larger scheme of the meaning crisis and how to help people live their lives, and what I do in psychotherapy, I mean, it's like, obviously we're going to deal with subjectivity in the real world.
Well, I was going to say that book on the mind leaves you with a picture of the mind that is completely existentially irrelevant. It leaves out the first person perspective, and it leaves out what you call mind three, which is, your personhood. Right.
Totally.
And that can't, I mean, well, this sounds like Whitehead, but that can't be an adequate account. In fact, it seems to leave out most of what we consider existentially, morally, politically, legally important about, well, I was going to say having a mind, but a better way of being a mind.
Of being a mind, exactly. And if we just knew, okay, yes, here's mind one. And, and then like I talk a little bit in my book, we can talk about mind 1A and mind 1B. That's the transition into behavior. And we can give good examples of that, like Stephen Hawking. So it's the motor neuron disorder, and boom, that system. But if we have the right vocabulary, then we can read that and help people position it and get all the good knowledge, but not think that's the whole picture. That to me is what's so frustrating about our fragmented psychology. And if we can help bring psychology and cognitive science together and say, actually, we have the edges of this problem relatively well defined in a conciliant, coherent way. I think the utility of that is enormous. So.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think what you said about, this is a view of consciousness that has the potential to help ameliorate the meaning crisis. Yeah, to me, that for me would be at the ultimate value of what we're trying to do here
Well,
together.
obviously, that's the beauty of your phraseology. It's like, well, we need to realize what's relevant.
Yeah, right. Well, that was the argument I wanted to make today, and I'm sorry it was a little bit more monologic, but you were there. It was helpful, and like I said, I don't intend to do this again. But there was things I wanted to sort of show.
I thought it was
This part needed to be sort of. There was a lot that needed to be laid out in a very linear fashion.
I think we've made the jump from perspectival into participatory. I think the optimal grip is clear. I think, you know, this was a key element, and the whole rover thing is such a cool story anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I enjoyed it, hearing that deeply, and it was, you know, it's impactful in terms of, oh yeah, I do that with Tetris.
Yeah. So I propose that we'll start turning towards some of the existing theories about consciousness, and putting what we've built together into a deep dialogue, hopefully mutually transformative, with those existing theories. So
Perfect.
I wanted to, as always, thank you, my friend.
Thank
This
you.
is always it's always fun. It's always a lot of fun, and I really appreciate that. And so I want to thank everybody who's watching, and I look forward to meeting with you again, Greg, and I look forward to interacting with people who are watching this series.
Amen. Great job. We'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.